Thank you for joining our panel discussion, Ensuring Food Authenticity and Trust Through Transparency. I'd like to thank the Engage Again team, Rain and AIM, for this opportunity to speak with all of you today. Before we begin, I'd like to go through a couple of housekeeping items. We have a very engaging discussion planned for today, so we ask that attendees either save your questions for the end, or you can use the tools in the platform to submit questions through the chat function. So I'm Julie McGill, and I am the Vice President of Supply Chain Strategy and Insights at FoodLogic, and I'll be the moderator for today's panel. We'd like to start by having our panelists introduce themselves. So I'll hand it off to Dr. Charlebois.
Well, thank you, Julie. So my name is Sylvain Charlebois. I'm the director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University in Canada. That's in Halifax on the East Coast. And our lab has been operating for about 5 years now, and our focus is very much the future of food, but we look at both ends of the food continuum. So traceability is certainly one focus that we have as a lab, but we also look at all of the issues affecting food distribution from farm to fork. And so obviously consumer trust, food authenticity, supply chain transparency are all issues we look at very closely, very seriously. And we do release reports regularly as a lab every 2-3 months on a variety of issues, on produce consumption, salmon consumption, on consumer trust, on buying habits online, offline. And if you're interested in looking at some of our reports, they're all free, and you can actually go on our website, just Google Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University, and you'll find all our reports for free, and they're available in both French and English.
And Felix, I'll have you go next.
Well, thank you very much, Julie. I'm Felix Amiri, as shown there, Technical Director at AFIS, that stands for Amiri Food Industry Support Services. And I provide technical support for different companies, my clients. I'm a key contributor to the SSQA concept as safety, security, and quality assurance that is being deployed in different companies, mostly my clients, but anyone is welcome to inquire about it and see how it can be applied in your systems or your operations. Basically, I also teach the Canadian and international food law and regulations at a college nearby. It's located in Cambridge, Ontario, Canada. And again, there are different things that I'm involved in, mostly consulting and then the teaching and driving the safety, security, and quality assurance concept through the different interests. That's about it for me.
Great. All right. And finally, we have Tony Small.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, my name is Tony Small. I'm the Chief Business Officer at Wiliot. So Wiliot, at a high level, we provide battery-free sensors that, amazingly, this is what it looks like. It's about 10 cents per sensor, and it charges from the air, and it can be applied to food and food containers that really bring unparalleled transparency at super low cost. We serve customers worldwide, and I look forward to contributing to this discussion.
All right, great. And so finally, rounding this out, I'm Julie McGill, as I said, and I'm here at FoodLogic. And for those of you not familiar with FoodLogic, we develop solutions that really move the supply chain forward. And so really meeting just the increasingly complex needs of a global food supply chain, and really looking at all those things that really modern food companies are facing. So one of the things that we have here is we have a mission. Our mission is to map the world's food chain, make it as safe as possible, and empower people to make informed decisions about the food they eat. And so we do that through a supplier management platform that enables everything from food safety compliance, quality incident management, recall management, and then whole chain traceability. And so With that, I would like to pass this off to the team. We want to start talking about, what are some of those traceability drivers that we're facing today? And the food industry really has been grappling with food authenticity, trust, transparency, and just a whole host of regulatory requirements. And these things, as they've come about, these regulations, et cetera, we're starting to see more and more of an emergence with traceability requirements, very specifically around events that need to be recorded and the data tied to those events that needs to be captured. In some places, these regulations are already in place, and in others, like here in the US, Food Safety Modernization Act, there's a Section 204 that is currently being finalized and will become a regulation very soon. So whether it's food fraud, or we're talking about provenance, allergen information, or even these regulatory requirements, all of these questions are referring to the same issue. And it's that whole ability for a brand to be able to communicate information that is trusted. And that might be information that you're communicating inside your four walls, that you're communicating with your trading partners, or even information that you want to go to the consumer. And in order to do this, companies need to understand, what am I gathering and sharing today? And then be able to evaluate and decipher what they need to prepare for these pending regulations. And with all these requirements, with all these regulations, there's one thing that's really clear. This is going to be a group effort, right? That supply chains are really ecosystems. There's a number of dependencies across, they really run across the supply chain with all the different partners, the locations, and the products that are moving through our supply chains. So this group, we're going to talk about things related to labeling, but we're also going to talk about enabling with technology. So when we talk about groups like AIM, we talk about AIDC, which is automatic identification and data capture. That advanced data collection and this whole idea of interoperability, these things will create a foundation that will allow companies not only to be compliant today, but really to build a foundation that takes you to the future. And so when we look at current labeling systems and things like that, there's a lot of good things that are happening today, and we have more information. But how can compliance and then using technology to gather and share information, how can that really assist in us getting to that next, those next requirements that we need to achieve? So I'm going to jump into our first topic here. As I talked about this demand for transparency, so much of this is tied to labeling requirements, right? That's what consumers see, and they trust that the information that's being shared is accurate, it is current, and that they can make informed decisions. So in looking at label requirements, really, I'd like to ask the group, there's a lot of complexity here, as well as ever-changing requirements. And so, for example, here in the US, for a long time, we had the Big 8 allergen list. We've recently added a 9th, and that is sesame, and that's going to become required effective January 1st, 2023. And we know that this happens in other countries as well, right? So this labeling requirement has now become a new rule. We have to all comply with this. So Felix, I'm going to start with you, right? Navigating these complex labeling requirements really can be a challenge. And how do we know all of the regulations that apply to a product or a product line?
How much time do you have, Julia?
Exactly.
That's a loaded question, but I'll try to give it the best that I could do to explain it. It's one of the great challenges that food operations face. The question of which regulations apply. I have a product line, so who do I go to, or what agency is responsible? It's a huge area. So I'm going to try to give you some strategies and steps that you can take. First of all, the first thing that a company wants to do is identify the jurisdictions that are applicable. Without that, every other thing falls apart, because what jurisdictions, what are their regulations is the main question you want to, first of all, address. And the secret is there are only two jurisdictions to be concerned with: where you're manufacturing and processing of your product, and then you have to consider the sales jurisdiction. They're not always the same. And so, first of all, the manufacturing jurisdiction is local, but if you're global as an operation, then you have different manufacturing locations that would have their jurisdictions. Typically, if you are global, you're likely to be selling in the same jurisdictions where you're manufacturing, so that helps. However, if you are manufacturing one country and selling to other countries, or within the same country and selling to different states or provinces, there are unique regulations that you need to deal with. So that is the first step. The next thing you want to do is identify the regulations with a series of questions that apply to your operation. And those questions really would help you determine which jurisdictions apply to your product specifically, and what specific regulations within those jurisdictions apply to your operation. And here are the series of questions. First of all, you want to ask the question, do I have a regulations that deals with consumer safety, the need and interest? That's one of the things. Once you have identified that regulations, you move on to the next. Do I have a regulations that deals with the identity of the product that I'm making? And those identities becomes tricky because depending on what your product is, if you name it a certain way, certain regulations restrict you from actually using those names or descriptions for your product. So you need to identify that. The next thing you want to identify, or the next set of regulations you want to identify, are regulations that deal with the composition of your product. That's the formulation. What ingredient additives are permitted, to what levels, the maximum and minimum limits. You want to identify those regulations that help you identify that to do your product. Then you ask about the function of the food. If you're claiming a function for your food, are there specific regulations? Some of these regulations would, one regulation can deal with a number of these items, but there could be separate regulations for this because of the magnitude of what it's addressed. And then the huge part of your question will be manufacturing process or operations. What regulations deal with that? Now, the others that we've mentioned will be dealing with food, but now you are getting into things like environmental regulations, labor laws, and this is where you actually capture that. You have to examine your manufacturing process and operations, and of course, all of the laws that apply to that would have regulations. So as a food operation, you cannot say, I'm only working with food regulations and forget about environmental. You have to deal with that because some of your processes may involve effluent that needs to be dealt with. And once you identify that the effluent is likely to be done with the jurisdiction, the municipality where you're manufacturing, then you know who to deal with and the agency. And then, of course, you go into other things like special claims. If you're making special claims, you need to identify the regulations that deal with that and what steps you need to follow to get the certifications that are necessary for certain claims. And the biggest one that affects us here right now, as we're talking about labeling, the duty to inform consumers is a regulation that you must search for. And so you ask yourself, have we regulations that deal with that? And then, of course, all of the typical prerequisite programs and good manufacturing practices regulations that deal with those will be separate. In the Canadian example, the food and drug regulations will deal with things like additives and claims, but then you have the Safe Food for Canadian regulations that deal with the specifics of the preventive controls and prerequisite programs, facility structures, and all of those things. Safe Food for Canadian regulations will be dealing with that. The US have similar arrangement where the FD&C regulations, food, drug, and cosmetics regulations cover generally things like additives, but then you have the FSMA, food safety, modernized food safety program that all regulations that have been. So those regulations will deal with specific areas. And then lastly, you want to ask your question if you have regulations that deal with your trade requirements, legal trade requirements. Otherwise, you will not be able to sell your product out of your manufacturing site. You need to understand all of those regulations. And these are the series of questions. If you need a list of what I've just gone through, and at any time, you can contact Julie or some of the AIM people, and they can contact me and I can provide that list for you. But these are the questions you need to ask in order to identify all of the regulations that apply. I hope I covered it all, but
I think you did. And I actually have a follow-up for Sylvain. You know, when we talk about all the things that Felix just covered, Safe Food for Canadians has labeling requirements that enable traceability. And so could you talk a little bit about that particular requirement, that labeling requirement that now is required in Canada?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I think Felix did a pretty good job walking us through the different questions that companies have to ask themselves. It's complicated. There are a lot of things you have to think about when you're labeling a product. As a country, though, I must say that Canada is not necessarily a high performing nation when it comes to traceability. We're still, I think, a little behind. As a lab, we've actually benchmarked Canada with other countries around the world. Just recently, we published a study in the journal called Comprehensive Reviews in Food Safety and Food Science. It's one of the highest ranking journals in the world in food science. And in that article, we do look at Canada through global lens, and we're way behind. And the reason why we're behind is that sharing data within the supply chain is something that is not overly natural. It's not done efficiently in Canada. And all the things that Felix has mentioned, you need data, you need accurate data in order to really populate your label accurately, essentially. So that's certainly a big problem that we're seeing. The up one, down one philosophy has been quite predominant, but what we're talking about here, and which is encouraged by the Act, is transversal traceability from farm to fork. So you can actually provide more information to a consumer that is looking for more information. And I think everyone knows that that information will foster trust, essentially. And it's been a challenge in Canada. I think the Act, which came into effect in 2019, will force companies to think about traceability much more seriously, to commit to traceability. But often what I find, and I don't know if you guys agree with this, but traceability has always been intertwined with the concept of food safety, and food safety doesn't really sell. It's like selling a safety belt with a car. People won't necessarily pay more for a safety belt when they buy a car. They just expect the seat belt to be there when they buy a car. It's the same for food safety. When people buy food in Canada, and I would argue it's the same in the US, they expect the food to be safe. And traceability kind of was seen as extra costs without generating more revenues. But now with the issue of food fraud, mislabeling, and things like that, food traceability is actually gaining currency, I think, more so than before. So I actually do think there's going to be some movement there over the next little while.
Great. Yeah, and I totally agree.
Yep.
It is often overlooked, but it definitely is something that now I think is gaining ground because we need data for so much of what we do. So I want to move on to, and we touched on this a little bit, but just want to touch on a little bit further, is when we talk about regulations, we're really navigating all these various rules. And Felix, you hit on some very good points about, where you're sourcing things from, or where you're making things, where you're selling them, right? Those all have an effect on the regulations that you need to be aware of and enforce with your products. This is a real challenge for food companies. And so I wanted to ask, navigating these strict regulations provide consumers with the information they seek, but many companies struggle, like Sylvain just said, struggle with this data. So what steps or methods can companies follow to identify those regulatory requirements? You touched on it a little bit, but I'd like to go a little bit deeper.
Yeah, it's a slightly different question, Julie. When we're talking about traceability there, Dr. Sylvain, you mentioned the fact that people just tag on as an added cost. But regulations, as we know now, they're beginning to emphasize traceability. And how do you find that information? And sometimes the language is not the same that is used in different regulations from different jurisdictions. And you may be able to decipher as you read through them that they're actually talking about traceability, because when you have to make a claim and you cannot track the identity of that item, as I mentioned earlier, identity of components. Usually the reference is made to identity preservation through your process. Now, if I say that, you may not know it's traceability, but however, you have to read through the regulations, pick up on those terms that are used in order to provide the right information for consumers and regulatory inspectors or anyone who inquires about your operation and labeling. And there are some techniques for reading through regulations to pick those items or those elements out that you want to declare or make known to your consumers. It is complex again, and because of that, we come up with some techniques for understanding this. So when you're reading through a regulatory clause, you want to identify some basic elements within that clause. There are mandatory elements that you must meet, but there are optional within the mandatory. So for example, I say you must have sufficient hand washing facilities for your operation, or you must declare the source of your product, where it's coming from, the origin. Those things will be mandatory, but you have to identify the origin is optional to you, where you want to buy your product from. And what is satisfactory number of hand washing stations? You have to know your employees. Some of them are specified, say 1 per 20 employees, but you may locate them in such a way that they are not efficient for use. And if you don't understand the mandatory aspect of it, if you think it's all optional. So those are the elements. You have mandatory, optional, but there is a very important element that you also want to keep in mind, because as you read through the regulations, you'll find they reference other regulations. That's another technique for knowing all of the regulations that apply. You have to pay attention to those elements so you can know which regulations apply in order to go get the information from those regulations that are referenced within the clause list, to provide the right information for your consumers. And then, of course, there are genuinely optional things that you want to do, guidelines that you may follow or not follow, depending on your operation. But usually it's recommended that you follow those guidelines that are provided by the regulatory bodies. Now they're called documents by reference, incorporated by reference in Canada, and they're guidance documents in the US. These may not be the regulations directly, but if you don't follow what those guidelines provide, you'll not be able to understand. So there is that element within the clause as you read it that may direct you to a guideline, and you may ignore the fact that it's just a guideline, but you'll find that elsewhere it becomes a regulated element that you must pay attention to and provide the right information for your consumers. So you gather the intelligence about consumer safety, need, and interest. You identify the labeling regulations that apply. You manage, or should at least manage or tame the usual enthusiasm of marketing departments, so that you're not making claims that you cannot support. And you use the regulatory labeling guidelines where provided to help you navigate or help your employees navigate through what they must provide. Capitalize on the regulatory cross-referencing, as I mentioned, and subscribe to updates from regulatory agencies. A lot of them provide that now. Those are some of the ways to navigate through these regulations and some steps to take in order to identify those elements within those clauses that you need to gather information for.
Yeah, and then on top of it, I think there's that whole layer of, depending on your role in the supply chain, some of those best practices, et cetera, are actually expressed in guidelines from grocers, from restaurant operators, et cetera, on top of the, here's what's required. Right. And then I got another bar that you have to cross in order to bring that product into my facility or my restaurant and things like that. So yes, absolutely. So with this, let's touch on some of those best practices, right? Because a brand's promise that is truly realized when trading partners exercise those best practices across their organization. So whether I'm a producer, a distributor, a grocer, or a restaurant, there are things that, when we talk about, here are the things that I have to do, and then here are the things that, are part of our food safety culture or are part of our, the products that we buy, if we're all organic and things like that, right? Those regulations tie in to that promise, right? You've got to have all the documents to back it up. You've got to know the provenance. You need that traceability to prove that it is what you say. So, implementing those best practices really ensures that authenticity and safety. And you said it really well, Felix, when you said, when you read a lot of these things, suddenly you realize that they're talking about traceability in that regulation for what they're requiring of you. So where should companies begin when implementing labeling best practices to ensure that authenticity and that safety?
Another good question. The thing we must keep in mind here is the duty to inform consumers through your label and even customers. And so the best place to begin would be, again, keeping in mind the traceability, as you mentioned, Julie. You have to start right from the growing or harvesting. The identification at those points, because once those points are not well identified or the item is not well identified at those beginning points, you lose traceability. You introduce ambiguity. So you need to start. And if you're dealing with suppliers who are growers or harvesters, that's one thing you want to emphasize. Identify so that when it comes, I know exactly what it is. And there is no blending or mixing of items from different sources because you have the identity according to the labeling requirements of the sources. And then you have to implement good management systems for tracking incoming materials and for tracking them through the processes that you use. So identification, information that should go into the labeling needs to also be well managed, right from the supply through the approval, the conversion procedures, the converting from raw material into finished products or intermediate products. You must keep that traceability identification sequences going through that as well. And then gathering the correct and legal information for the label, reading through the labels to gather that information or intelligence that you apply to your label. So the best practices for labeling really starts from the farm or whatever the harvesting locations, if you're in the fisheries type of operations, to start right from there through the processes. The greatest challenge is where ambiguities like to be introduced is through the conversion. When you're converting raw materials, blending them, mixing them, and the onus becomes on the operators, the food companies, to make sure that they have very strong system. And as Dr. Chabois mentioned, you need to gather the data and information, have a system for managing those data so that you can accurately represent them in what you provide on your labels. Otherwise, you introduce ambiguity. And traceability, again, plays a big role in this. Identification through the identification of lots and batches that come or shipments that come, all of those. And it's a challenge, I understand, for the industry. but thankfully we have some technological systems that will help us manage those well. Data provisions that some groups are providing for the companies. Companies, food businesses need to take advantage of all of these opportunities and resources and tools that have been made available through those systems and provisions.
Yeah, and I think too, for the interpreting all of this and then figuring out, how do we speak to each other? So, the current graphic that we have up is about GS1 standards and GS1 being a global organization, the standards are global, but the implementation is local, right? I have things in Canada that I need to do. I need to label my packages a certain way. There might need to be certain pieces of information on the label on that consumer unit, as well as the case or even the pallet, that have to be captured so that that information can be shared. And so recognizing that we've got these regulations and we do the labeling, but then how do I use tools to automatically capture that data and show that movement of the product, right? There's the foundational data, what is it, and things like that. But then there's that information about the transaction. It's moving, like you just talked about, when there's a transformation event and I'm combining ingredients and making a product, I now have to collect information at all these different data points across my supply chain. So Tony, I'd love to hear from you, ensuring that authenticity and safety is absolutely key for consumers. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on how can technology enable this level of visibility, and how can technology really enable trust?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And it's really fascinating listening to this discussion, because I think the reality is that even though there will be regulations and there will be government requirements and standard body requirements, et cetera, what I would encourage companies to do is look beyond that. There's sort of the baseline of what you have to do. And then it's really about getting enough data that can be compelling to customers that you then turn that into a competitive advantage compared to everyone else. And the example that that was brought up before about the seatbelts is a really good one, because for a while, seatbelts are certainly not, by Sylvain, seatbelts are not a competitive advantage. But before airbags were actually required in the late 1990s, they were a competitive advantage for those car manufacturers that implemented them in cars. So don't wait for the regulations to say you have to do A. Start thinking about not only delivering A, but also B, C, and D before the regulatory government agencies actually require them. And that can give you a really big advantage. And I'll give you one example. For example, I like analogies, but just give you another analogy. When you look on Netflix, what do you look at when you see a show? You look at where it was produced and you look at when it was produced. We actually require more stuff about the things we watch on Netflix than the things we actually put in our bodies. Because when you get some milk from the grocery store, you don't know exactly when it was produced. You don't know exactly where it was produced, but we still require those things for other parts of our lives. So if we can get data, which technology can now allow you to do, to provide insights as to where it came from, when it came from that location, and provide that to consumers, they will likely see that as incredibly valuable, especially if you provide that data in a very highlighted way and your competition does not.
Right.
If I may,
yeah,
Julie,
I can talk about the technology piece too, but I'm happy to sort of let other people chime in.
Do technology next, so hold your thought
Okay,
there,
great.
if you'd like to go ahead.
So sorry, Tony, I didn't want to interrupt, but you made some really good comments there. I just wanted to make a point about our current context, the pandemic. If there is one piece of technology that has gained currency over the last 18 months is the QR code. And the QR code, as far as I'm concerned, is making our populations more data focused and literate. Every 2 days, everyone is being asked to download information through a QR code, and that can actually provide transparency, or that can actually make a supply chain way more transparent in a second. And I think that could actually be quite empowering for food companies out there looking at, going back to Tony's point about competitive advantage. I mean, certainly there is an opportunity right now, I think, given what's been happening over the last 18 months.
Yeah.
Yeah, an example, and just to build off the QR code, like, just to show what our technology looks like. This is a tag. It has the QR code. Imagine this, and it doesn't have to be our technology, it could be any company that does this, but imagine this on, the milk carton, and it's on the milk carton, and it says, use your scan this QR code to know where it was produced, when it was produced, and the whole life cycle of the milk. A lot of people would love that, and a lot of people would really
Absolutely.
benefit from that.
So it's almost like I paid you to say that, Tony, because GS1 has a sunrise for consumer units where we are going to be sunsetting the traditional, like here we use the UPC in the US. We are sunsetting that, and trading partners all across the supply chain need to have optical scanners so that they can read QR codes. So there's going to be a period of time where you have a barcode and a QR code, because you're going to have some folks who can read one or the other. But by 2027, suppliers will be able to remove the barcode and just have the QR code. The question is, which system is reading the QR code and what do you want it to do? So if I'm scanning at point of sale, there's information that I need. But if a consumer uses their phone, I can point them to my product's website and tell you all about that gallon of milk that you're about to buy. So the opportunities are endless. I think getting to what you were showing us, because you also have a sensor, correct on there. So like on top of, I can put a whole bunch of information into this data carrier. I can also, how I read that, whether I can scan it with my phone and gather information, or other readers are, using RFID to pick that up. There's a ton of opportunity for us, for the actual products to share information and for us to gather information about the movement of product and what things are happening. So that was a perfect segue into, I want to get into technology, because I know, certainly with this conference and this group, this whole idea of, all that we've talked about today, technology is such a big part of this. And there is data that is shared at all points in the supply chain. So if we go from that farm that we talked about earlier, all the way through to the consumer, and I love how you said that, Sylvain. We're training them, right? With the pandemic, they now understand I don't need a fancy app to read that code and get the menu. But that took partnership with different groups so that all carriers, right, that my camera knows when it reads this, here's what you do, right? So it's not just as simple as, oh, we rolled this out and everyone gets it. So so I'd love to talk about, you had 2019 report on food recalls in Canada. So looking at, traceability impacts and the ability to remove suspected food from the industry. Do you just want to talk about a little bit about that report and how technology can enable it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously food recalls are, when they work well, they are good. It's when they don't work well that they become a problem. And of course, as any other nation, Canada has to deal with recalls. And sometimes, obviously, the product being recalled actually comes from abroad, and so that really adds a layer of complexity. The one thing that I find a little bit disappointing is that with COVID, for example, we've been able to develop in weeks an app which would allow anyone to know whether or not they've been exposed to someone else who may have had COVID. but we still don't have an app allowing people to know in real time if they actually have a recall product in their fridge or in their cupboard. That's technology right there. I actually think that the technology actually exists. We never actually focused on it. I think, again, going back to context, there's a bit of an opportunity here. And frankly, as we exit this pandemic, I actually think that we're going to be dealing with a group of consumers who will be very focused on risks and systemic risk. We've been talking about public health forever now, and we've been talking about risks for a very long time. And so when we're done with the virus, people will start thinking about risks very differently, including risks related to food. And so if there is a recall, and frankly, when there's noise in the news, it's very difficult for companies or public agencies like Canadian Food Inspection Agency to get the attention of people when there is a recall product. You need technology to connect with people in real time. If you don't do that, you're exposing consumers to unwarranted risks. And that's what we're at right now. And that's why I think companies need to start thinking about connecting with consumers. The supply chain blew up with the pandemic. The supply chain is much more, I would say, democratic. A lot of people have tried to transact with consumers. You're seeing processors dealing with consumers. Kraft Heinz actually is operating restaurants in Canada now, 3 restaurants in Canada now, just to give you an idea of how things have changed in just 2 years. So that connection brings power, but it also brings more responsibilities related to food safety and food recalls. So I actually do think that technologies can actually help some of these companies connecting with consumers so they can protect themselves, essentially.
Right. And you know what's interesting is right now there's a recall on like some like charcuterie meats, and it affected one of the big stores. It's a national chain here in the US. And I've had a couple friends, because they know I work in food safety, they're like, hey, I got a notification from that retailer saying you may have purchased an item. Now, because the consumer units don't have batch lot or serialization and things like that, they know approximately the ballpark of, you shopped at our store, we know that affected products may have been on the shelves. But wouldn't it be amazing to do what you had just said, right? It's tied to, it knows what's in my refrigerator, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, a few years ago, we had a huge lettuce recall.
Oh, yes.
Nobody was buying greens in Canada.
Yep.
And so think of the waste. The waste, it was unbelievable.
Yes, and that's a huge one. Well, and I'd love to walk through that, Tony. I know we've got some slides, the impact of technology on food recalls. How can technology serve the entire product life cycle to enable this supply chain visibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think technology will play a really massive role here. So it includes some of the really great scenarios and opportunities that Sylvain talked about. I mean, you can imagine a refrigerator having like these tags on every item, and then you just know, like through a sensor through some very light infrastructure, is anything in my fridge recalled? Like that's a very amazingly straightforward scenario given the technology we have. A lot of it is, this is sort of like what Wiliot provides. The key thing you need data from farm to the supermarket and then eventually to your fridge. And one of the challenges that previous technology has is that the infrastructure can be pretty costly and can be pretty obtrusive. It's one thing to implement infrastructure to do intense tracking in a facility that you manage, or a factory, or a supply chain where there's conveyor belts and just very systematic processes. But it's hard to do it when you're collecting zucchini from a farm, and you have like farms worldwide that you have a network of. Like, how do you start capturing that data? So some of the technology that we offer is that it's not only these like really super inexpensive chips that cost about, like, again, 10 to 20 cents, getting to sub 10 cents soon. But it's also very low and lightweight infrastructure. Like, we're talking about like a $40 one-piece device in any area where you want to do the sensing. And you don't even need to scan it. It will just sense it as long as it's within, a 10 to 20 meter vicinity. That kind of sensing technology, which we provide and maybe other companies may provide, is really what is going to enable this farm to fork tracking that will then inform these communications to customers, whether they scan a QR code or whether it's a more proactive communication. If you go to the next slide, this just kind of shows, I think that we have a slide that shows sort of an example of what this looks like. And this is actually shows an example of something we're actually doing with one of the larger retailers right now, where we have all of the food is in a crate, like, so say it's like one specific type of food, zucchini. We collect it from the farm. It goes through this whole process. There's no individual scanning of crates. All the data is collected automatically. And just give you one example of just a fascinating thing that you can actually collect with this is you can actually track the time it takes from an item, like a cucumber again, to go from the farm to the supermarket shelf. And when we did that, you can actually also track the temperature and other aspects as well. And you can create, for example, a cumulative temperature, like how much heat has this basket of cucumbers accumulated over the whole life cycle from when it was picked to when it was actually shown on the supermarket. That's the kind of data that new technology can actually provide, which would then in turn provide a great customer experience in terms of just the taste and freshness of their food, but also in terms of what they might expect from dynamic labeling that could provide a competitive advantage to markets and food providers.
And Tony, I'm going to expand the challenge for you then, technology providers, because that identifying the item and knowing its whereabouts and where it has been is great. But also you mentioned temperature tracking as well, and that took my interest in saying perhaps there are also some maybe under development technology that could identify hazards for the operators to know, okay, this cucumber has, it's been maintained through the normal traceability and storage and provenance sequence, but one cucumber, all of the other cucumbers are fine, but one has a hazard contamination level. If there's a sensor that can do those, perhaps that's something that is already being thought about, but that is a challenge now for you to see if you can extend into those areas as well to help, in other words, prevent before it actually goes to the point of being recalled.
Yeah, that's right. And this is where it sort of comes into just like deep knowledge of food, because like different types of food will have different temperature thresholds and different time periods in which it can survive or continue to be healthy if it's beyond a certain point. I think in one of the markets we're working with, they actually identified issues already. It's like, okay, one of the markets is one of the steps along the way in their supply chain that impacts maybe 5% of their cucumbers is actually experiencing a potential issue. And they were able to address it really quickly and then really just ensure end-to-end safety for their customers as much as possible.
Excellent.
That's I mean, possibilities are endless. It's amazing what we can do with technologies, for sure.
Well, thank you everyone for such an engaging conversation. I think that if there's any takeaway for our audience today, certainly it is to, do your research, understand your supply chains, and really embrace the value of that data and being able to have technology help you bridge all of this together. So I have one question that I'd like to pose to the entire group. So for everyone, what is the most significant challenge that public regulators are facing right now when thinking about supply chain transparency?
I guess I can start things off. I would say really it is to get the supply chain to work together, essentially. I think everyone knows that. There's in the agri-food sector, it's not overly natural to partner with other companies. There's, especially in Canada, because we do have oligopoly powers that actually impact food distribution. Few companies actually control the entire market. It's basically five companies control the entire market. So there's a lot of tension, and so I think that it really adds that layer of complexity. And so if you can actually go beyond that, and when we talk about transparency, when we talk about trust, you have to work together. It's the same goal for everyone. It's like climate change and labor and energy. I mean, there are a lot of these systemic issues that really require some collective work. And so I think that's probably the biggest challenge that I see.
I'll just jump in there too and say, working together and without fear or concerns is one of the other challenges that regulators face, especially because of their position. Regulators tend to inspire, if you might say, the fear of giving them too much information. And companies have actually expressed this to me, that they want to be careful what information they provide in this working together, collaborating and sharing information for database, or for data management or data sources. And they're afraid that they want to protect their proprietary. And so they don't want to give too much information out because they have some to protect. And also to prevent regulators from coming back at them because of the information they provided. So they have these fear. And that poses a challenge to regulators because companies are not forthright in providing information that's necessary. Of course, it's understandable that certain information is proprietary and should be respected. But at the same time, there should be a comfort and no fear of sharing information because it helps us all in the end. And regulators, by their position, should be encouraging this. I don't know how they're going to go about it because they have this relationship with food businesses or industry in such a way that is almost antagonistic, but it's time to be friendly now and share information freely in such a way that we can help each other through those. And regulators may have a part to play in encouraging that, and that could be a challenge.
And the one thing I would add to that is I'm certainly less enmeshed in sort of like the regulatory environment, but just from a consumer standpoint, because based on Sylvain's and Felix's comments, regulations are really hard. They're hard to design, hard to implement. You have a lot of competing constituents, like probably fighting for their own point of view. My advice would be to just look beyond the regulations and look to what consumers really want and what they need, and start designing your data infrastructure to sort of meet that long-term need. Eventually, the regulatory environment will get there, and then you'll have a strategic advantage that you can that will help you in the marketplace.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, so much. This really has been an engaging presentation, and certainly I hope that our audience has lots of questions ready for us. Here's our contact information. So if any of you want to reach out to us on this panel today, we've included our information, and this deck will be available as part of the conference materials. And with that, I'd like to move to the Q&A.